Section 1. Opening scene November 7, 1943. On the morning of November 7, 1943, the weather over northern France was deteriorating. A low overcast hung above the English Channel, the kind of grey that erases the horizon and makes the sea indistinguishable from the sky. Visibility was fading, and wind shear was becoming a serious concern for the fighter pilots preparing for what should have been a straightforward escort mission. The 8th Air Force was mounting an operation. 26 Marauders from the 9th Air Force were going after German airfields at Montdidier and Moulins, relatively close targets that shouldn't require the full length of the escort radius. It was a mission that ought to have been routine, the kind of operation that happened dozens of times, aircraft taking off, bombers escorted to the target, fighters turning back before fuel ran critical, everyone landing back at their respective bases with stories to file away and nothing more. 2nd Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, was supposed to be part of that routine. He was flying a P-47 Thunderbolt that morning, serial number 42-22-490. The aircraft had a name painted on its nose, beatly a reference to the aircraft's chunky, bulbous profile that reminded American crews of the insect rather than the sleek, razor-thin fighters that European pilots had been flying since the start of the war. Roach wasn't even supposed to be flying that particular airplane. He was a replacement pilot that day, pressed into service when another pilot in his squadron, 1st Lieutenant John Lanfear, had experienced engine trouble and couldn't continue. Roach got the spare, and that decision, that small substitution in the morning's routine, would send both Roach and Beetle down a path that neither he nor anyone in the squadron could have anticipated. The mission began normally enough. The escort flight joined up with the bomber formation over England, and they pushed south across the Channel toward the continent. What began as routine quickly became complicated. The headwind was stronger than forecast, more than 100 miles per hour, pushing against the Thunderbolts as they climbed. Roach was watching his fuel consumption anxiously, seeing the numbers tell a story that was increasingly worrying. The extra power it took to push through that wind was burning fuel at a rate he hadn't anticipated. By the time the mission was complete and he turned back toward England, Roach knew his fuel state was critical. It was marginal. It was cutting it close in a way that should never have happened, but weather and wind and the nature of air combat meant that sometimes the margins got thinner than anyone wanted. What happened next was a cascade of things that all went wrong in sequence. The poor visibility, the cloud cover, the disorientation that comes from flying blind in an overcast with no landmarks below. Roach became confused about his location. The compass and radio and all the instruments in his cockpit told him one thing, but his sense of direction, his understanding of where he was, told him something different. And somewhere in that grey soup, in the confusion of trying to navigate back to England while managing a fuel crisis, Roach turned himself around completely. He was flying south instead of north. He was heading toward occupied France when he thought he was heading toward friendly airfields and home. Below him, as he descended through the clouds looking for a place to land before his engines quit, he saw what he was looking for. A runway. A grass airfield with good approaches, well maintained, the kind of thing that would have been familiar to any fighter pilot. Roach was focused on one thing at that moment: getting the aircraft down safely before the fuel ran out completely. He made his approach. He lined up on the runway. He put the big Thunderbolt down on the grass. The landing was clean. The aircraft came to a stop. The engine ticked as it cooled in the November air, still warm from the climb and transit, now settling into the cold as Roach sat in the cockpit, relief flooding through him. He'd made it. He'd found an airfield. He was down safely. He was home. He was not home. He was at Knarpik, an airfield 30 miles behind the German front lines, occupied by German ground crews who had been watching the American fighter on its final approach with their mouths open. Roach had landed directly into German captivity. As he climbed out of the cockpit, he found himself surrounded by uniforms he didn't recognize and soldiers pointing weapons that were distinctly unfamiliar. Within hours, he was being processed as a prisoner of war. Within days, he would be on his way to WWII, a German prison camp on the Baltic coast, where he would spend the remainder of the war. But the aircraft Beetle was just beginning its story. The Thunderbolt sat on a German runway, still intact, all 8 of its .50 caliber machine guns still armed, the turbo supercharger still cooling down, the cockpit still smelling of sweat and hydraulic fluid and the particular aroma of an American fighter that had just completed a combat mission. It was the first complete, intact, flyable P-47D that the Luftwaffe had ever captured. For the German military establishment, it represented an intelligence windfall of the first order. For the pilots and engineers of the Luftwaffe who had been fighting the Thunderbolt over France for the past 8 months, it represented an opportunity to answer questions that combat could only hint at. Within 3 days, a priority message went out from German command to the Aviation Test Center at Rechlin, 300 miles away, on the shores of Lake Müritz in Mecklenburg. An intact American Thunderbolt had been captured. Evaluate it. Measure it. Determine everything you can about its capabilities and its systems. Report findings immediately. The man they sent to handle that evaluation was a pilot named Hans-Werner Lurch, though he was known in the Luftwaffe simply as Lurch. He would spend the next several weeks flying the captured P-47 and studying its systems, producing a technical evaluation that would shape German fighter tactics and pilot training for the remainder of the European war. But more importantly, what Lurch wrote about that cockpit, a cockpit so complex that he felt compelled to record it in his memoir decades later, tells us something profound about the collision between 2 different engineering philosophies, 2 different approaches to how men and machines should work together, and what those differences reveal about industrial capacity, design thinking, and the nature of complexity itself. Section 2. Hans Lurch, Germany's master of captured aircraft. To understand why Lurch's evaluation mattered, you need to know who Lurch actually was. He wasn't just another test pilot doing routine work. He was the Luftwaffe's most experienced evaluator of captured aircraft, and his credentials for that role were extraordinary. Hans-Werner Lurch was born in 1914. He grew up with an obsessive interest in mechanical things, particularly aviation. In his youth, he worked his way from building flyable glider models with his own hands to actually piloting full-sized Glidursa progression that wasn't easy for a young man from a working-class German family struggling through the economic depression of the 1920s and early 1930s. His family relocated to Breslau when Poland regained territory after the First World War, and his mother, a librarian by profession, had to support 4 children on her husband's military pension, which inflation had eroded to nearly nothing. But Lurch's passion for aviation never wavered. When the Nazi regime came to power and Germany began its rearmament, the infrastructure for aviation training expanded dramatically. For someone like Lurch, who had already demonstrated both technical aptitude and flying skill, the opportunities suddenly became available. By the time the Second World War actually began in 1939, Lurch had already been involved in aviation for years. He had transitioned from glider flying to powered aircraft. He had received formal training as an aeronautical engineer, not just as a pilot, but as someone who understood the mathematics and physics behind what aircraft actually did. This combination of skills was rare and valuable. The Luftwaffe recognized it, and Lurch found himself assigned to Rechlin, the Reich's principal aviation test facility. Rechlin was unlike any other military aviation organization in the world. It was where every new Luftwaffe aircraft type went through its initial testing and evaluation before being accepted for operational service. It was where experimental aircraft were flown and measured and pushed to their limits. It was where captured enemy aircraft were brought to be systematically analyzed. And by 1943, Lurch had become the establishment's principal test pilot for captured Allied aircraft. Over the preceding years, he had flown more than 125 different aircraft types. That number deserves a moment's thought. More than 125 different aircraft types. In a decade of test flying. At an establishment whose daily business was evaluating machines that had never been proven safe, or that had been taken from an enemy whose engineering decisions couldn't be inferred from casual inspection. Aircraft that sometimes broke in ways nobody expected. Aircraft that occasionally killed the men who flew them. Lurch's perfect safety record through all of that flying, never crashing an aircraft, never seriously damaging one, completing his evaluation flights and returning safely to produce his reports was testament to something that went beyond just being a good pilot. It spoke to an almost obsessive attention to detail, a methodical approach to flight testing, and an ability to understand not just how an aircraft flew, but why it flew that way. What made Lurch uniquely valuable to Rechlin, though, wasn't just that he was an experienced test pilot. It was that he was also a trained engineer. A pilot without engineering training could describe what an aircraft felt like in the air. He could tell you about handling, about responsiveness, about how the machine behaved at its limits. An engineer who could also fly could describe what the aircraft was actually doing and explain why it was doing it. Lurch could do both. He could feel the aircraft's behavior through the stick and rudder, and he could analyze the systems that produced that behavior. He could identify the specific engineering decisions that had been made and connect each one to its functional purpose. His observations weren't impressions or subjective reactions. They were the output of a trained mind, educated in mathematics and physics and aeronautical design, applied to the problem of understanding a new aircraft. By 1943, Lurch had already evaluated British fighters like the Spitfire in multiple variants, the Hurricane, the Typhoon. He had tested American aircraft the P-39 Airacobra, which had also been provided to Soviet forces. He had flown captured Soviet aircraft, including the Petlyakov Pe-2 bomber and the Lavochkin La-5 fighter. He had evaluated Italian aircraft from North Africa. He had flown German experimental types that were still in development and that nobody outside of Rechlin could properly test. He had built a comparative framework that spanned years of systematic work, and that framework was enormous. When the priority message arrived from German command about Beetle, the captured P-47, Rechlin selected Lurch for the evaluation. He wasn't a random choice. He was the most qualified person in the Luftwaffe to understand what he was looking at, and to produce an evaluation that would matter. Section 3. Rechlin, where air power met scientific method. To understand the context in which Lurch's evaluation took place, you need to understand Rechlin itself. The facility had been established in the 1920s, originally as a general aviation testing center. By the time the Second World War began, it had evolved into something far more specialized and sophisticated. Rechlin LRZ, officially, was located on the southwestern shore of Lake Müritz in Mecklenburg, in a region of northern Germany that offered specific advantages for high-altitude testing and evaluation. The long runways, the favorable approach paths over the lake, and the largely unpopulated airspace of the Mecklenburg Lake District meant that aircraft could be put through demanding test programs: terminal velocity dives, high-altitude testing, maximum performance evaluations without overflying populated areas or endangering civilians. Rechlin tested every new Luftwaffe aircraft type from initial prototype through type acceptance and service entry. It maintained standing programs for engine certification, armament evaluation, equipment testing, and the systematic study of foreign aircraft. By 1943, the establishment had become the technical apex of the German military aviation intelligence structure. Everything that the Luftwaffe captured in the field eventually moved toward Rechlin. The Wehrmacht's technical intelligence units were the first layer, securing intact aircraft and shipping them to a collection point. Rechlin was the second layer, conducting systematic evaluation and producing the technical intelligence reports that answered the operational questions that fighter commanders needed answered. Those questions were specific and demanding. What was the aircraft's service ceiling? At what speeds did it hit structural limits? How was the armament installed and what were the rates of fire? How were the fuel and oil systems configured? What cockpit procedures did the aircraft demand, and what did those procedures imply about pilot workload? For captured Allied aircraft, these answers shaped how Jagdwaffe pilots trained to fight the new types, and how German aircraft manufacturers designed countermeasures against them. The culture at Rechlin was one of measurement and documentation. The establishment's credibility rested entirely on the accuracy of its reports. A test pilot who guessed about performance figures, or who allowed personal opinion to color technical findings, would undermine the entire purpose of the facility. Lurch understood that. His record across all of his evaluations: no accidents, no loss of aircraft, complete technical reports produced with precision, reflected his understanding of what was at stake. By 1943, Rechlin had accumulated data on aircraft from every major theater of the war. French fighters from the fall of France in 1940. Soviet types from the Eastern Front. Italian aircraft from the Mediterranean and North Africa. British types going back to the Battle of Britain. American aircraft arriving in increasing numbers since late 1942. Lurch had evaluated examples from all of these. When he was tasked with evaluating the captured P-47, he was placing that aircraft against everything he had previously measured. He was encountering a specific set of design decisions made by engineers at Republic Aviation and Pratt & Whitney and General Electric. And he was comparing those decisions against every other fighter he had flown. Section 4. Fighter philosophy: divide simplicity versus complexity. To understand the magnitude of what confronted Lurch when he climbed into the P-47's cockpit, you have to understand the design philosophy that dominated German fighter aircraft in 1943. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G, the standard Luftwaffe frontline fighter at that moment, had a cockpit that was notoriously cramped and offered poor rearward visibility. But the engine management systems had been progressively simplified over years of production and service experience. The DB605 engine in the G variant operated with a two-stage mechanical supercharger, throttle and mixture controls, and a separate propeller pitch governor. That was it. Those were the primary engine management variables that a pilot had to actively control. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, had standardized instrument panel layouts across all German fighter types. Black-faced instruments with white needles in defined positions that did not change from aircraft to aircraft. A Luftwaffe pilot who was transitioning from a Bf 109 to any other fighter type would find the airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, RPM gauge, and engine pressure instruments exactly where his previous experience had taught him to look. Consistency. Standardization. Reduced pilot workload through eliminating the need to learn new layouts. The Focke-Wulf 190 had taken this philosophy even further. Its BMW 801 radial engine was coupled to a device called the Kommandatur, literally, the command device. This was a mechanical hydraulic computer that automatically coordinated throttle position, propeller pitch, mixture ratio, supercharger boost setting, and cooling flap position from a single power lever. A Focke-Wulf pilot moved one control, and the Kommandatur handled the rest. The workload reduction was substantial. Attention that would otherwise have been consumed by engine management went to the combat environment, where it was actually needed. The philosophy behind the Kommandatur was explicit and deliberate. Remove complexity from the pilot. Replace it with a mechanical system that makes optimal decisions automatically. The underlying assumption was that pilots under fire cannot reliably manage 5 interdependent variables simultaneously, and therefore the correct response was to reduce those 5 variables to 1. It was a coherent design philosophy. It produced effective combat aircraft. It produced cockpits that were relatively simple to learn and relatively forgiving in operation. A pilot could focus on tactics and situational awareness rather than being consumed by the technical management of the engine. Republic Aviation and Pratt & Whitney had made the opposite choice with the P-47. They gave the pilot direct authority over the R-2800 systems with gauges tracking each variable and dedicated controls for each adjustment. The philosophy was not that pilots could not handle complexity. It was that pilots who understood the system could extract performance from it that automation could not anticipate. A skilled pilot who knew how to manage the engine's variables could push the aircraft beyond what an automatic system would allow. He could hold higher manifold pressures in specific conditions. He could use the anti-detonation injection system strategically to maximize power when the tactical situation demanded it. He could coordinate propeller pitch with throttle movement in ways that a mechanical system might not optimize. It was a philosophy grounded in the idea that the human brain, given the proper tools and training, could be more flexible and adaptive than any mechanical device yet invented. Both philosophies were coherent. Both were defensible. Both produced effective combat aircraft. And they could not have been more different. Section 5. The Thunderbolt's architecture. Why it was different. To understand why the P-47's cockpit demanded so much from pilots, you have to understand the aircraft's fundamental architecture. And that architecture flowed directly from one engineering decision. The choice of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double WASP engine and its turbosupercharging system. The R-2800 was an 18-cylinder, twin-row, air-cooled radial engine rated at 2,000 horsepower in normal operations. War emergency power ratings used in short-duration emergency situations exceeded that. It was the most powerful air-cooled piston engine in operational service anywhere in November 1943. It was also, by the accumulated evidence of wartime service, one of the most reliable. The Hellcat was proving this over the Pacific. The Corsair was proving it in the same theater. The Thunderbolt had been proving it since the spring of 1943. But the double WASP didn't breathe like other fighter engines. It breathed through a General Electric C3 turbo supercharger mounted not in the engine cowling but behind the cockpit, low in the fuselage. The system was fed by exhaust ducts running the full length of the aircraft from the engine all the way back to the turbine, and then the compressed air ran back forward to the engine. The turbo was exhaust-driven, extracting energy from the exhaust stream that would otherwise leave as waste heat. At low altitude, this design added weight and complexity without decisive benefit. The conventional supercharger in the engine itself was sufficient for low-altitude power. But at high altitude, above 25,000 feet, where the thin atmosphere reduced the density of air entering a conventionally supercharged engine, the turbo maintained near sea-level charge density. The engine received the dense induction charge it needed to produce rated power regardless of altitude. That was the engineering logic behind the aircraft's size. The entire lower rear fuselage of the Thunderbolt was, in large part, a housing for the exhaust ducting and intercooler assembly. This was why the aircraft had that deep, round belly that made it look to European eyes, accustomed to the slim silhouettes of the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt 109, almost implausibly large for a single-seat fighter. This was why it weighed more than 14,000 pounds fully loaded. This was why when it appeared over France in the spring of 1943, German pilots looked up at something that did not fit the visual category of a single-seat fighter at all. The Thunderbolt was built around an engine management problem of enormous complexity, and every system in the aircraft flowed from that central architectural decision. Section 6. Inside the cockpit. Lurch confronts the unfamiliar. Lurch arrived at Knarpik on November 10, 1943. He walked out to the apron where Beatles sat under guard, climbed the wing root, and lowered himself into the cockpit. What he found in that cockpit would stay with him for 34 years, until he finally published the record of it in his memoir in 1977. The first thing that would have struck him, immediately, was the sheer number of instruments. The instrument panel held approximately 30 separate gauges, warning lights, and indicators. That was unprecedented in Lurch's experience with fighter aircraft. The standard flight instruments airspeed, altimeter, artificial horizon, directional gyro, rate of climb, turn and bank were where a European pilot would expect to find them. But everything else reflected American cockpit layout practice rather than the Luftwaffe's standardized configuration. Every switch, placard, and label was in English. One feature caught Lurch's professional attention with evident respect. The Americans had marked engine limit ranges on the instrument faces in red and green color coding. Red for the prohibited range, green for normal operation. A pilot unfamiliar with the aircraft could read the engine limits at a glance from the instrument face itself without consulting a separate document or having memorized the numbers from a type conversion course. German instruments of the same period used white needles on standardized black faces, readable and consistent across types, but without that immediate limit range legibility under stress. He found this specific enough to record in his memoir decades later. It was a human factors solution that the American designers had found, and his own service had not yet adopted. But the color coding was almost a distraction from the deeper problem. The cockpit Lurch was staring at was built on design assumptions that had no counterpart in anything Rechlin had previously evaluated. The turbo-supercharger wastegate controlled the proportion of exhaust gas directed through the turbine versus bypassed around it. The pilot managed the wastegate to hold manifold pressure within limits at a given throttle setting. Too much boost at the wrong operating point meant detonation, cracked cylinder heads, destroyed exhaust valves. A separate tachometer on the panel monitored turbine RPM with its own overspeed warning light because a turbine running beyond rated speed could destroy itself and damage the engine with it. The intercooler shutter controlled the temperature of the compressed induction air after it left the turbo. Compression heats air, and hot dense air is less dense than cool dense air, partially defeating the purpose of the compression. The intercooler extracted thermal energy from the charge. Open it too far and the charge was overcooled, risking carburetor icing at altitude. Close it too far and the charge ran hot, raising detonation risk and losing power. The carburetor air temperature gauge monitored this variable. The pilot adjusted the shutter continuously, reading one gauge to manage the control that affected another gauge. This was not a secondary consideration. This was a core task in managing power in flight. At war emergency power, the pilot engaged the anti-detonation injection system, spraying a water and methanol mixture into the induction charge to suppress detonation at manifold pressures above the normal military limit. The ADI was a 5-minute resource. When the tank exhausted, the engine returned to its standard limit. The system had its own pressure indicator. The pilot had to activate it, monitor it, and be aware of when the tank was running dry. The constant speed propeller was governed electrically through a separate RPM lever. Throttle and RPM were related but distinct tasks. During a combat power change, a pilot who applied throttle without adjusting pitch risked overspeeding the propeller or allowing it to lug, producing conditions that were operationally dangerous at the moment they appeared. The fuel system fed from multiple internal tanks with individual gauges for each left wing, right wing, main fuselage, auxiliary. Center of gravity shifted as the tanks depleted at different rates. The pilot managed selection on a schedule before entering combat. External drop tanks required jettison, a separate action with its own sequence and consequences. The 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns required gun heater switch activation before reaching altitude because unheated mechanisms froze at the temperatures of the upper atmosphere and failed to cycle. The arming switches for the electrical firing circuits were separate from the gun heaters. A pilot could activate heat without arming, or arm without heat. Both would result in a non-functional weapon system if the sequence wasn't correct. The hydraulic system powered the flaps, landing gear, wheel brakes, and cowl flaps with its own pressure gauge and accumulator state indicator. Consider what that list meant when assembled into a single cockpit. The Messerschmitt 109G pilot managed throttle and RPM as his primary engine variables with supercharger stage selection as a secondary consideration. The Focke-Wulf 190 pilot managed one lever and let the commandator handle the rest. Neither had a turbo-supercharger tachometer to monitor, an intercooler shutter to adjust, an anti-detonation injection system to activate in time, or a multi-tank fuel system requiring active selection during combat maneuvering. The P-47 pilot had all of these in addition to the standard workload of combat flying and had been trained on each system individually through the American Type Conversion Program. He arrived at a combat assignment with the panel internalized through hundreds of hours of training. Lurch had arrived at it cold, on a captured aircraft at a foreign airfield, with no manual and the translation process still in progress. His task was to understand a cockpit whose American pilots had trained for months to master, in the time it took to walk around the aircraft and study the panel. That he could do it at all was a testament to the depth of his engineering background. That even he found the system demanding enough to record it specifically in the memoir, decades after the war, is the measure of what the cockpit required. Section 7. The system's problem demands. No German pilot expected. Lurch was particularly specific about one system in his evaluation, and the specificity matters because it tells us something about his approach. He was not recording a general impression of unfamiliarity. He was identifying the exact mechanism that had given him pause and explaining why it was not immediately self-evident. The flap system in a European fighter of the period was straightforward. A hydraulic actuator, simple in design. The same circuit drove both wing panels. Both deployed to the same angle, and the pilot had no reason to think the two sides might behave differently under varying pressure. The P-47D's flap system included an equalization mechanism that automatically corrected discrepancies in deployment angle between the left and right wing panels, maintaining symmetric deployment under varying hydraulic pressure conditions. European fighters of the period did not use this arrangement. The hydraulic circuit therefore behaved in ways that a pilot trained on German or British aircraft would not anticipate. And the documentation explaining the system was still being translated when Lurch arrived. He decided before attempting takeoff to test the flaps at a safe altitude first, operating them in incremental steps and observing each stage of deployment. This was the correct procedure for an unknown hydraulic system on a captured aircraft with no reference material. It was also a precise description of what the cockpit required. Patient, methodical investigation from the Luftwaffe's most experienced captured aircraft evaluator before he would commit to the aircraft. The instrument panel itself became a forest of dials and switches that had to be understood in relationship to each other. The wastegate indicator and manifold pressure gauge had to be read in concert. The propeller RPM lever had to be coordinated with throttle movement. The carburetor air temperature gauge had to inform decisions about the intercooler shutter position. Every adjustment had a consequence that showed up on a different gauge, and managing all of these relationships simultaneously while also flying the aircraft through three-dimensional space and being aware of the tactical situation was what the American training system had taught its pilots to do. Lurch's technical evaluation, when he finally completed it, would include measurements of performance at multiple altitudes, handling characteristics, structural limits, and the specific behavior of each major system. But what his initial cockpit study revealed was something more fundamental. This was not a cockpit built on assumptions of automated simplification. This was a cockpit built on the assumption that the pilot was an intelligent agent who could manage complexity if he was given the proper tools, proper training, and proper documentation. It was a cockpit that demanded something from the pilot that went beyond just flying an airplane. It demanded engagement with the aircraft systems at a technical level that was not standard in the Luftwaffe's approach to fighter design. Section 8. Strategic context. Why Germany needed this evaluation. To understand the urgency with which Germany treated the evaluation of Beetle, you need to understand what was happening in the air war in November 1943. The second Schweinfurt raid had taken place on October 14, Black Thursday, as it came to be known. 291 B-17 fortresses had flown against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The P-47 escort covered the first leg of the mission and turned back at its fuel limit, which was somewhere around the German-Dutch border, approximately 200 miles from the English bases. The bombers flew on unescorted for more than 300 miles across defended German territory. The Luftwaffe's waiting interceptors attacked in organized waves. 60 B-17s were lost. 594 American airmen were killed, captured, or wounded in a single afternoon. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration daylight operations. The loss rate was simply unsustainable. The bomber crews were being sacrificed on the altar of a doctrine that had proven catastrophically wrong. But the loss of the bombers wasn't the full story of what had changed. The Luftwaffe had won a tactical victory on October 14, but the strategic situation was moving in a direction that Germany could not control. The P-47s had been improving as a fighting aircraft through the months of 1943. The escort range had been extending progressively. In March, when the Thunderbolts first entered combat, they could escort the bombers only to the German-Dutch border. By July, with the first 75-gallon external drop tanks, the escort radius had extended to the Frisians and the approaches to the Ruhr. The Thunderbolt groups flying with those drop tanks could now accompany the bombers to the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland that the 8th Air Force's strategic planners had identified as a priority objective. German controllers had to reposition their interceptor concentrations further east. By September, 108-gallon tanks had pushed the boundary into northwestern Germany. The German command recognized the trend. If each new tank pushed the escort further east, the conditions that had made deep penetration bombing survivable for the Luftwaffe were going to change. 3 weeks after Schweinfurt, the captured P-47 sat intact on a German runway, and the German command needed to understand its true range capacity, its performance ceiling, its structural limits, what the exhaust turbo did to altitude performance, and the deeper question. Was the 108-gallon tank the ceiling of the external fuel program, or was it an early point on a curve with more still ahead? The specific intelligence requirements that a captured P-47D could address were these. At what altitude did the Thunderbolt give it its performance advantage? How far did that advantage extend above the altitudes where German fighters were comfortable? What happened to the P-47's performance when forced down low? How abruptly did that advantage reverse? How was the cockpit organized? What did its complexity imply about the pilot workload the American training system was building to support? Lurch's evaluation would answer each question with measured data rather than combat impression. Section 9. The measurement performance data that changed everything in the weeks following the initial ferry flight from Knarrpik to Rechlin. Lurch conducted a systematic evaluation program. Ground inspection phase documented aircraft systems in detail, working from the engine forward through the cockpit and outward through hydraulics, fuel, electrical, armament, and navigation equipment. Translated cockpit cards were prepared. A test program was constructed. The performance evaluation measured speed at multiple altitudes, rate of climb, service ceiling, and diving speed limit. The handling assessment covered stability and control through the full envelope, including stall behavior and the specific handling characteristics of the turbo-supercharger system under varying conditions of altitude and power. At sea level, the P-47D reached approximately 500 km per hour, inferior to both the Messerschmitt 109G and the Focke-Wulf 198 at the same altitude. The aircraft was large and heavy. The turbo was of no particular advantage near sea level. Its frontal area produced drag that cost it in low-altitude speed comparisons with the German types. Lurch concluded that the Thunderbolt was not suited for close-range turning combat or low-level attack. A P-47 pilot who let himself be drawn into a turning fight below 10,000 feet with a German interceptor was accepting an unfavorable engagement. At 9,000 meters, approximately 29,500 feet, the measurement was 640 km per hour, roughly 400 miles per hour in level flight. At that altitude, the Focke-Wulf 190's BMW 801 was working at the ceiling of its mechanical supercharger and losing power rapidly above it. The Messerschmitt 109GS two-stage supercharger was more capable at altitude, but still capped. The Thunderbolt's exhaust-driven turbo was designed for those heights and maintained power that neither German frontline type could match above 30,000 feet. In a sustained dive from altitude, the P-47D's weight converted to speed, and the airframe absorbed loads that would have overstressed lighter designs. Lurch concluded that the aircraft was excellent at altitude, in diving attacks, and at maximum boost, not a dogfighter, but a high-altitude platform that used its performance envelope correctly and disengaged in a dive when disadvantaged. The assessment aligned precisely with what American P-47 pilots had independently worked out in combat from the other side of the same problem. Fight high, stay fast, dive when disadvantaged, never let the aircraft be drawn into a turning engagement below 10,000 feet. Colonel Hubert Zemke and the 56th Fighter Group had worked out exactly this tactical solution through combat. The 56th had been building a kill record that German fighter leadership was tracking carefully. Lurch's evaluation, conducted on the ground and in the air with precision instruments, confirmed what Zemke's pilots had discovered through repeated encounters with the Luftwaffe's best. The engine, Lurch recorded, ran smoothly on every flight he made in Beetle. He had noted the same quality on every American aircraft he had evaluated at Rechlin. The R-2800 had been running through weeks of operational service before Roach set Beetle down at the airfield. It continued to run without incident through the entire evaluation. That reliability was not incidental to the cockpit's complexity. Every one of the gauges on that panel was monitoring equipment that actually worked. The performance data told the German command something it already suspected from combat but had not been able to measure precisely. The Thunderbolt's advantage was not uniform. It was conditional on altitude. The altitude above which that advantage became decisive corresponded closely to the altitude at which the 8th Air Force's heavy bomber formations flew their missions. This was not coincidence. The P-47 had been designed for that altitude, and its turbo had been engineered to maintain power there.